They called her the mail-order bride, a woman driven to the brink of loneliness by her past and gossip. On the train leaving the East, she carried not hope, but an unhealed wound. But fate brought her to a farm in the windy and sandy West, and there was a man who had lost everything, still quietly calling her mine, even though she had not yet left town. If it were you, after so many years of being hurt, would you dare to open your heart again? Do you have the courage to believe that love can still sprout from the ashes? Sometimes, what we fear most is not being alone, but having someone truly see us behind our strong shell. And at that moment, what will you choose, run away or stay? Join me in this story of healing, courage, and a love that came late and turned out to be the most fulfilling of all. If you feel it touches your heart, please like, share, and subscribe to my channel to continue this emotional journey with me. The train groaned as it climbed the long grade through the plains, iron wheels screaming against the cold November wind. The car windows were streaked with dust and sunset light, that soft copper glow that makes even forgotten things look like gold. Margaret Hale sat near the back, hands folded over a small brown valise. Inside it lay everything she owned: 2 calico dresses, a worn Bible, and a folded letter that had changed her life. The letter smelled faintly of ink and smoke, the kind of scent that belonged to old men writing by lamplight. She read it again, the paper trembling between her fingers. Dear Miss Hale, my name is Thomas Avery, of Willow Creek, Montana. A man can't run a ranch alone forever. If you would be willing to join me, I offer you a home, honest work, and companionship. The Lord knows I do my best to make you comfortable. Yours truly, T. The words weren't grand, but they had sounded like mercy when they first arrived at her boarding house back in Ohio. 10 years a widow, 10 years of empty rooms and stares that said pity, not respect. People whispered that a woman past 40 had no business chasing new beginnings. Yet here she was, a widow of 47, rattling westward past mile after mile of winter grass, chasing a stranger's promise. The porter passed by, tipping his cap. "Ma'am, we'll be stopping at Willow Creek in 40 minutes. "Thank you," she said softly. Her voice carried the calm of someone who had learned that silence was safer than complaint. Outside, the land stretched forever, sagebrush, dust, the occasional windmill turning against a peach-colored sky. Every few miles a hawk lifted from a fence post, wings wide, vanishing into the dusk. She wondered if Montana smelled different from Ohio. Maybe the air would taste cleaner, sharper, like pine and snowfall. Maybe the folks there wouldn't look at her as the widow who talked too softly and worked too hard. A young couple across the aisle laughed together, the woman holding a newborn wrapped in a patchwork quilt. Margaret smiled faintly, then turned her gaze back to the window. The reflection staring back was lined and pale, but her eyes still held that quiet spark, the stubborn belief that life could still begin again. The train slowed briefly at a small station to take on water. A group of men boarded, loud and rough from the stockyards. One of them unfolded a newspaper and began to read aloud. "Listen here, boys, another story about them mail-order brides. Says a woman got herself tricked down in Wyoming. Man never existed. Some broker collecting fees off lonely hearts. They laughed, crude and careless." Margaret's hands tightened around her valise. "Guess folks'll believe anything when they're desperate," another man said. The laughter filled the car. She kept her eyes on the window, pretending the prairie outside was endless enough to swallow the sound. When the train finally slowed for Willow Creek, the last of the daylight bled out of the horizon. The whistle blew long and low, a note that seemed to mourn and welcome all at once. The station was little more than a wooden platform and a flickering lantern. A sign swayed in the wind. Willow Creek Pop. 312. She stepped down carefully, boots crunching against the frost. The air hit her like glass, thin, sharp, alive. Men in dusty hats unloaded cargo feed sacks, lumber, mailbags. Margaret looked around for a tall man with a brown hat, just as a letter had described. Her breath came in small clouds. The platform emptied until only a few strangers remained, waiting for freight. Then she saw him, or thought she did. A man approached, early 50s, narrow shoulders, dark coat buttoned to the throat. His eyes were gray and restless. "Mr. Avery?" she asked. He stopped. "Who's asking Margaret Hale?" she said, offering the letter. "From Ohio." "You wrote," he cut her off. Voice low but sharp. "I didn't write you." She blinked. "Sir." He took the letter, glanced at it, then crumpled it in his fist. "Must be some scam. I never sent no such words. You'd best get back on that train." A few townsfolk nearby turned their heads. Whispering started, that same tone she knew too well, mockery hiding behind curiosity. "She come looking for a husband," someone muttered. "Guess he changed his mind. Mail order bride, huh?" Margaret stood still, heat rising to her face though the air was freezing. Her fingers ached around the valley's handle. "I'm sorry," she said finally. Her voice was steady, quiet enough to sting. "I didn't mean to cause trouble." The man turned away, muttering something about crazy women and false letters, then disappeared into the darkness beyond the depot lamps. For a moment, the platform was silent except for the hiss of the departing train. The conductor's lantern swung once. Then the engine pulled away, leaving her behind in a gust of coal smoke. She was alone. Her breath trembled out in the cold. Around her, the townsfolk drifted off, some shaking heads, others snickering under their breath. She could have wept, but she didn't. Instead, she lifted her chin, straightened her coat, and whispered to herself, "You've survived worse." Maggie. From the shadow near the freight office, a man watched. He was taller than most, broad-shouldered, hat pulled low. His coat was lined with trail dust, and his eyes pale, steady. The color of rain-washed steel studied her quietly. When she turned to leave, he stepped forward. "Ma'am," he said. His voice was deep, calm, like gravel smoothed by years of weather. "You look like you've been dealt a bad hand tonight." She hesitated. "I suppose I have." He glanced toward the empty street where laughter still echoed faintly. "Folks here forget their manners sometimes. Name's Elias Grant. I own Grant Ranch, about 8 miles west. You'll freeze if you stand here much longer. I don't wish to trouble you, Mr. Grant. It's no trouble." He nodded toward a waiting wagon hitched with 2 chestnut horses. "Got a spare room and a warm stove? You can stay till you figure things out." Margaret looked at him, this stranger with weathered hands and eyes that seemed to carry both grief and patience. "Why would you help me?" she asked. He adjusted his hat. "Because decency shouldn't be as rare as gold out here." For the first time that night, she almost smiled. "Thank you," she said. "Come on, then," he replied. "It's a rough road, but the stars'll keep us company." He lifted her valise easily onto the wagon bed. As they rode away, The lights of Willow Creek dwindled behind them until all that remained was the hum of wheels on frozen dirt and the whisper of wind through the pines. Margaret Hale looked up at the western sky, wide, unending, scattered with 1,000 cold stars, and thought, maybe silence isn't empty after all. The night wind cut sharp across the open plain as the wagon rolled west, lantern light swinging from its side. The horse's hooves struck a steady rhythm against the hard-packed dirt road. Margaret pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. The cold was not cruel. It was clean, honest, like everything else she'd seen of this place so far. Elias Grant handled the reins with practiced calm. His profile, lit by the swaying lantern, showed a man who had lived too long outdoors to be easily rattled. His beard was flecked with gray, his coat thick with trail dust, and his eyes fixed on the faint ribbon of road ahead. He didn't speak much, but the silence between them felt steady, not awkward. After a while, she said softly, "Do you always offer rides to strangers, Mr. Grant?" He gave a small shake of his head. "Only when they look like they don't deserve the way folks treated them tonight." She looked down at her gloved hands. "They weren't wrong about me. I did come as a mail-order bride. That's what they call women like me." His voice was gentle, but sure. Names don't always tell the truth. I've been called worse things myself. The wagon crested a small hill. Below them spread the dark valley of the Grant Ranch, hundreds of acres of rolling pasture, dotted with cottonwoods and fenced fields that shimmered silver under the moonlight. A wide barn stood near a cluster of corrals, and beyond that, the outline of a big house, 2 stories, built of pine logs and stone. "It's beautiful," she murmured. Elias nodded once. "She used to be. The land's tired. So am I." When they reached the yard, 2 ranch hands came out from the bunkhouse men, rough and respectful, their hats tipped toward the boss. One of them, a wiry man in his 60s with a limp, nodded at Margaret. "Evening, Mr. Grant." "Who's the lady, Miss Hale?" Elias said. "She'll be staying a while. Fix up the spare room in the east wing." "Amos." The man, Amos Reed, looked at her kindly. "Yes, sir." "Welcome, ma'am." Inside, the house smelled faintly of cedar and smoke. The hallway walls held photographs blackened with time, a woman in a long white dress, a boy grinning beside a horse. Margaret's eyes lingered on them, but she didn't ask questions. Elias led her to a room overlooking the barn. There was a narrow bed, a small stove, and a window that framed the stars like a painting. "It isn't much," he said, "but the roof doesn't leak, and the stove draws fine." "It's more than enough," she replied. He hesitated at the door. "You can stay until you decide where to go next. There's work if you want it. The house could use a woman's hand again. I'll earn my keep," she said. He met her gaze for a moment, steady, unreadable, then nodded and left her to rest. That night, she didn't sleep much. The bed was warm, but her mind kept circling the same thoughts, the laughter at the station, the stranger's kindness, the endless horizon waiting outside. Somewhere in the house, she heard the creak of floorboards, then the slow footsteps of a man who couldn't sleep either. When dawn came, the world outside was silver blue with frost. Margaret rose early, wrapped herself in her shawl, and went to the kitchen. The place was neat but unlived in cold ashes in the hearth. Empty jars on the shelf, a thin layer of dust on the table. She found coffee grounds, built a small fire, and set the kettle to boil. The smell filled the house, rich and dark. Elias came in from the barn, coat dusted with hay. He stopped short when he saw her by the stove. Didn't expect company this early. "I couldn't sleep," she said. "Coffee's ready, if you'd like some." He poured a cup, took a sip, then gave a small nod. "You make it strong. That's good." They ate breakfast and quiet biscuits from the tin, a few slices of cured ham. Afterward, Margaret asked if she might tidy the parlor. "Do what you like," he said. "No one's sat in there in years." She found the room dark but graceful, an old piano with a cracked key, lace curtains yellowed by sun, and a large clock that had stopped long ago. Dust lay over everything like snow. She opened the curtains, letting in light. The view outside was breathtaking, endless pasture. Fences stretching toward the mountains, morn and mist rising from the valley floor. For the first time in many years, she felt the quiet kind of peace that didn't ask for words. By afternoon, she had scrubbed the floorboards and opened the windows to let in air. Amos appeared at the doorway, leaning on his cane. "House ain't smelled this clean since Miss Annie passed," he said. "You've done something good here, ma'am," Miss Annie Margaret asked gently. "Mr. Grant's wife," Amos said, lowering his voice. "Fire took her and the boy. Long time back." Margaret looked around the room, at the piano, the photographs, the heavy silence clinging to the walls. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Amos nodded. "He never talks about it, just works, sun up to sundown. Maybe your being here will change that." That evening, the ranch hands gathered in the yard to mend a fence. Margaret brought them hot biscuits and stew, simple kindness that surprised them all. Laughter returned to the porch for the first time in years. When night settled, Elias sat on the steps, pipe in hand, watching the stars. Margaret joined him quietly, her shawl around her shoulders. "The sky's different here," she said. "How so? It feels closer, like you could reach up and touch the edge of heaven." He smiled faintly, the first she'd seen. Maybe that's why people come out here, to see how far heaven really is. They sat without talking, listening to the crickets and the creak of the barn door. It wasn't comfort in the usual sense, but it was something steadier, deeper. Two lives, bruised by loss, finding a place where silence no longer hurt. Before turning in, he said quietly, "You'll be safe here. Miss Hale. Nobody at this ranch will call you names." She looked at him, the lamplight soft on his face, and what should they call me? Mr. Grant. He met her eyes. A lady who deserves peace. Long after he'd gone inside, Margaret sat alone under the stars. Somewhere deep in the house, that broken clock ticked once, just once, as if trying to remember how to begin again. She smiled faintly, whispering to herself, "Maybe I can, too." The days that followed settled into a quiet rhythm. The first snow of the season came early, a thin, glittering veil over the hills. From the kitchen window, Margaret watched flakes drift through the air like ash. It reminded her of winters back east. Except the silence here was deeper, so deep that even the sound of her breath seemed to belong to the land itself. Each morning, she rose before dawn to light the stove and brew coffee. The smell carried through the house, warm and steady. Elias always appeared just as the sun brushed the ridgeline, boots creaking on the porch. He didn't talk much, but his nods grew softer, less guarded. Sometimes he even stayed long enough for a second cup. The big house began to wake up. Margaret aired out the linens, scrubbed the wood floors until they shone, and opened every curtain. Light poured in like something holy, scattering dust motes that danced in the air. She repaired the lace tablecloth in the parlor, replaced broken buttons on Elias's shirts, and found a faded quilt tucked behind a trunk, a quilt stitched with the initials A.G. in one corner. When she asked Amos about it, he looked at the floor. Miss Annie made that. Every patch tells a story, first harvest, the colt being born, the boy learning to ride. Mr. Grant couldn't bear to see it after the fire. Margaret folded the quilt neatly and placed it across the back of the couch. That night, she found Elias standing in the doorway, staring at it. He didn't say a word, just touched the edge of one square, the one embroidered with a horse, and then walked away. She didn't press him. Some griefs, she knew, didn't need words. By the third week, Margaret had taken over the kitchen entirely. The hands began coming in early just to smell supper cooking. Beef stew simmered on the stove, biscuits puffed golden in the oven, and coffee stayed hot in a pot on the hearth. The men started joking again, their laughter echoing across the yard. Elias watched it all with quiet astonishment. "You've changed this place," he told her one evening. She smiled, wiping her hands on her apron. "No, Mr. Grant. It was only sleeping. I just opened a few windows." He gave a small nod, the ghost of a smile tugging at his mouth. "Still, it's good to hear the walls talk again." Late one afternoon, Margaret walked out toward the corral, where Elias was mending a gate. The air smelled of hay and snowmelt. He worked slowly, sleeves rolled, forearms taut as he drove nails into the post. "May I help?" she asked. He glanced up. "You ever used a hammer before I was a farmer's daughter?" she said. "I can manage." He handed her a smaller hammer and a handful of nails, side by side. They worked in rhythm, the sharp tap of metal, the crunch of boots in frost. A hawk circled overhead, its shadow gliding across the field. When the job was done, Elias leaned against the fence. "You take to ranch life easy." She laughed softly. "It's not so different from any life. You feed what's hungry, fix what's broken, and pray the weather doesn't ruin both." That made him chuckle, a low, rusty sound that seemed to surprise even him. As the sun dipped low, turning the mountains rose-colored, Amos came out with the mailbag from town. "Brought your letters, boss," he said, handing over a few envelopes. Elias flipped through them, then paused. "This one's for you, Miss Hale." Margaret took it carefully. The handwriting was familiar. Her stomach tightened. It was from Thomas Avery. She opened it later, alone in her room. "Miss Hale, what happened at the station was a misunderstanding. I was misled by others and acted rashly. If you can find it in your heart to forgive me, I'd still like to make you an offer of marriage. I can provide comfort and respectability. Think it over. She stared at the words for a long time. Comfort, respectability. Both had cost her dearly once before. She folded the letter and tucked it away in a drawer. When she saw Elias the next morning, she didn't mention it, but he must have sensed something different in her face. "Bad news?" he asked quietly. "No," she said, "just the past, knocking to see if I'd answer." "I won't." He nodded as if he understood exactly. Some doors don't need opening twice. The snow thickened that week. The ranch turned white and still. Margaret spent her evenings by the fire, sewing or reading from the family Bible she'd carried across half the country. Occasionally, Elias would sit across from her, oiling his saddle or mending tack. Their silence was companionable, the kind that didn't demand anything. One evening, she found him in the parlor, staring at the piano. His hand hovered over the keys, then withdrew. "Do you play?" she asked. "Used to. Annie did more than me." Margaret sat down and pressed a single key. The note rang thin but true. "It still holds tune." He watched her for a moment, then nodded. "Play, if you like." She began softly an old hymn, slow and tender. The sound drifted through the room like something fragile being remembered. Elias closed his eyes. When the song ended, he said, "It's been 15 years since I heard that tune in this house." She smiled faintly. Then it was about time. That night, when she went to her room, she found a small box on her pillow. Inside was a brooch shaped like a wildflower, silver tarnished with age. There was a note in Elias's rough handwriting found in the old drawer. Belonged to her. "She'd have liked you." Margaret held the brooch to her chest. For the first time in years, tears came not from sorrow, but from something softer, harder to name. The next morning, she pinned it to her dress. Elias didn't comment, but his gaze lingered for a moment longer than usual. Winter settled deeper, and with it, the quiet grew comfortable. The house that had once felt haunted now breathed again, wood creaking, fire crackling, footsteps crossing floors that had long gone untouched. And though neither spoke it aloud, both began to sense something stirring, something fragile, like green shoots pushing through the snow. The days shortened, and the air turned sharp enough to bite. Every morning, a thin crust of frost shimmered on the fence rails, catching the first light like a trail of diamonds. Margaret had grown used to the rhythm of the ranch, the early stir of horses, the clank of buckets, the crack of ice in the troughs. It was a world built on quiet labor, where the heart found rest in small, steady things. Elias worked outside from dawn until the lamps were lit. She could see him through the kitchen window, shoulders broad against the gray horizon, his coat dusted with snow. There was a kind of solitude around him that didn't feel lonely. It felt earned, like he had made peace with silence long ago. One afternoon, while mending a torn curtain, Margaret caught him watching her from the doorway. His hat was still in his hand, hair damp from melted snow. "You've turned this place upside down," he said. "I hope that's not a complaint." "No," he said, "just an observation." She smiled faintly. "Then I'll take it kindly." He hesitated, then added, "I'm riding out to the north pasture tomorrow. Fence needs fixin'. Wouldn't mind company if you're up for the cold. I'll bring a thermos of coffee," she said, "and biscuits." He nodded once, then left, his boots thudding softly against the floorboards. The next morning, they rode out together. The world was all white and gold, the snow glinting under the pale sun. Pine shadows long and blue. The horse's breath steamed in the air. Neither of them spoke much, but their silence had changed. It wasn't empty anymore. When they reached the north fence line, Elias dismounted and began to work. Margaret handed him nails, held the wire steady, and brushed snow off the posts. A hawk circled above, just a speck against the endless sky. "You're a hard worker," he said quietly. "I like seeing things whole again." He drove another nail, muscles flexing beneath his coat. "You make me forget how quiet it used to be here." Was that a good quiet or a bad one? He paused, looking out over the valley. It was the kind that don't answer back. You live long enough with that, you start thinking maybe you don't deserve an answer. She studied him for a moment, wanting to say something that wouldn't sound like pity. "Finally," she said, "some silences are punishment. Others are healing. Maybe yours is ready to change its purpose." He looked at her then, snowflakes melting on his beard. "You talk like a preacher, just someone who's learned to listen." The wind picked up, carrying their words away into the wide white distance. By late afternoon, the sky had darkened with the threat of a storm. They finished the last post and started back. The horses moved slow through the deepening snow, hooves crunching rhythmically. "Storm's coming quick," Elias said. "If it hits hard, we'll bunk at the line cabin." The snow thickened fast, swirling around them. By the time they reached the small cabin, visibility had shrunk to a few yards. Inside, the place smelled of old wood and cold iron. Elias started a fire, and Margaret set coffee to heat. As the wind howled outside, they sat near the hearth, the flames painted soft gold across the walls, flickering against their faces. "Tell me something," Elias said. "Why'd you answer that letter in the first place?" She looked into the fire. "Because I was tired of rooms that never changed. I wanted to be useful again. Maybe I thought marriage was the only way a woman like me could begin anew." And now she smiled faintly. "Now I think beginnings come in stranger forms." He leaned back, silent for a while. Then he said, "Annie used to say something like that. She believed in second chances, even when I didn't." Margaret looked at him gently. "She sounds kind." She was, he said, his voice low, "too kind for this place. The fire took her and our boy before I could get home. After that, I just kept the land running. Didn't seem right to stop." Margaret reached across the small space between them, her hand resting lightly on his sleeve. "Work can keep a man alive, but it can't keep him company." He didn't pull away. The fire crackled softly, filling the silence. When the storm eased, they rode home under a heavy sky streaked with violet. The snow gleamed pale against the fading light. As they neared the ranch, the lamps from the house glowed warm through the windows, and for the first time, the sight felt like home to her. That night, she found herself humming while she cooked supper. Elias came in, brushing snow from his coat. "You're humming," he said, surprised. "Bad habit," she said lightly, picked it up from the wind. He chuckled, pulling out a chair. "Could do worse." After dinner, he lingered near the hearth. "You know," he said, "I ain't much for talk, but when you're around, the quiet feels easier." She met his gaze, the warmth of the fire flickering between them. "Then maybe we'll both learn to keep better company." He smiled, a slow, genuine thing that softened his whole face. "Maybe we will." The snow fell again that night, soft and unhurried, covering the ranch in silence. Margaret stood by her window, watching it settle over the fences and barns. For the first time in many years, she didn't feel like a guest in her own life. Downstairs, Elias walked through the empty hall, paused by the piano, and touched one of the keys. The note rang faint and pure, echoing through the house that was beginning to breathe again. In that quiet, something unspoken passed between them, something neither of them needed to name. By late February, winter began to lose its edge. The snow thinned, pulling back from the hills to reveal patches of brown earth and stubborn grass. Every afternoon, the air smelled faintly of thawing pine and distant rain. It should have been a season of quiet hope, but change brought its own kind of unrest. On Saturday mornings, Margaret often rode with Amos into Willow Creek to fetch supplies. The trip was 8 miles each way, enough time for the townsfolk to notice them. At first, They merely nodded politely. But in a small town, silence never stayed kind for long. By the third trip, she could feel the stares. Women at the mercantile whispered behind bolts of cloth. Men leaned against hitching rails, murmuring as she passed. A phrase drifted through the air more than once, the mail-order bride who found herself a millionaire instead. When she brought it up that evening, Elias looked up from the ledger at his desk. "You letting their talk get to you? It's not easy pretending you don't hear it," she said. "They think I came here to take advantage of you." He leaned back, studying her. "You know that's a lie." "I do, but lies have louder voices." He pushed the ledger aside. "Then let me handle it." "No," she said softly. "If we answer them with anger, they win. Silence will speak truer than shouting ever could." Elias nodded slowly. "You've got more patience than most men I know." "Patience isn't weakness," she said. "It's just knowing storms end sooner when you don't feed them." That night, she heard him pacing in the parlor long after midnight. The next morning, he was quieter than usual. A storm bottled under his calm. Around noon, word came that someone had painted words on the fence near the road leading to the ranch Gold Widow. Amos had tried to scrub it off before she saw, but Margaret insisted on going herself. The letters were harsh and black against the pale boards. She stood there a long while, wind tugging at her shawl. Elias watched from the saddle, jaw tight. "Let it be," she said finally. "Paint fades faster than truth." But that night, while she was asleep, the fence was clean again. Someone had sanded the boards smooth, repainted them fresh white. When she looked out her window the next morning, she saw Elias walking back from the gate, the paint still on his hands. At breakfast, neither spoke of it. Yet something unspoken passed between them, a shared understanding that dignity, once tested, became something worth defending quietly. Days later, a knock came at the door. A woman stood there in a fur-trimmed coat, her smile too sharp to be kind. "Mr. Grant," she said sweetly. "It's been too long." Elias's expression didn't change. "Mrs. Coulter, what brings you out this far?" Margaret recognized the name widow of a neighboring rancher, wealthy and respected in town. The woman's eyes slid toward Margaret with a look that measured, not welcomed. "I came to invite you to the Founders' Ball," Mrs. Coulter said. "It's next Saturday. Everyone will be there. I assume you'll want to bring company." Elias started to refuse, but Margaret spoke first. "Thank you," she said calmly. "We'll be honored to attend." The woman blinked. Surprised. "Well, splendid. Do dress appropriately. It's quite a refined affair." When she left, Elias turned to Margaret. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did," she replied. "If we hide, they'll write our story for us. I'd rather they see who we really are." That week, she worked late into the nights, sewing a new dress deep blue wool. Simple but elegant. Amos teased her gently. "Ma'am, you'll have half the town talking twice as much. Then let 'em talk," she said, smiling. "At least this time, they'll be looking me in the eye." The night of the ball, snow flurries danced through the lamplight as their wagon rolled into town. The community hall blazed with golden light, laughter spilling out into the cold. When they entered, the room fell briefly quiet. Margaret felt every eye turned toward her. She stood tall, her hand resting lightly on Elias's arm. He looked at her once, a small nod that said everything words couldn't. Mrs. Coulter approached, her smile brittle. "Why, Miss Hale," What a lovely gown. Did you make it yourself? Yes, Margaret said. I find beauty lasts longer when it's built by your own hands. A few nearby women exchanged glances. Elias bit back a grin. They danced once, slowly, under the soft lamplight. He wasn't graceful, but he was steady, and she followed easily. Around them, the whispers softened. Some faces even began to smile. Later, as they left the hall, Margaret paused outside the door. Snow fell thicker now, muffling the sounds of music and laughter behind them. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" "For standing beside me." He looked down at her, wasn't standing, just walking the same road. When they returned to the ranch, the fire still burned low in the hearth. Margaret took off her gloves and laid them on the table. "You didn't have to fix that fence," she said suddenly. He shrugged. "Didn't want to see it every time I rode out." "You sanded it clean," she said softly. "But I think it was something else you were trying to erase." Elias looked into the flames, voice quiet. Maybe I just wanted you to know you're safe here." "I do," she said. "And I want you to know I didn't come here for comfort or money. I came here because I was tired of living like a ghost. This place, it feels alive. You make it alive." He turned toward her then, something raw and unguarded in his eyes. "You don't know what you've done for this land. Margaret, it was just dirt before. Now it feels like home again." The clock in the hall struck midnight. Outside, the storm had quieted. Only the whisper of wind moved across the valley. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Margaret said, "You know, storms do end sooner when you don't feed them." Elias smiled faintly. "Guess I'm learning from the best." She laughed softly, and in that sound was everything that had been missing from the ranch, the hum of belonging, the peace of two souls who had carried silence long enough to know its weight. The wind outside changed direction, sweeping east. Somewhere in the dark, a coyote called, its voice rising and falling like an echo of something wild that refused to die. The first thaw gave way to rain, soft at first, then steady, drumming against the tin roof for days. The smell of wet earth filled the ranch. The snow that had blanketed the valley all winter melted into silver streams running through the fields. For Margaret, it felt like the world was beginning again. Each morning, she stood on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching the fog lift from the pastures. The land shimmered with water, the horses kicking through mud and puddles like restless children. Elias joined her most mornings now, his steps lighter, his eyes less shadowed. "Never thought I'd see this place green again," he said one dawn, rubbing his hands together against the chill. "You just had to wait for the season to change." She answered, "Everything heals on its own time." He gave a small nod. "Maybe folks do too." As the days grew longer, work on the ranch picked up. Fences needed repair, and the creek bed had to be cleared before the next flood. Margaret kept herself busy in the kitchen, making meals hearty enough to feed the hands and still have leftovers for anyone who stopped by. But even with all the movement, a quiet melancholy hung in the air. Elias spent long hours alone in the far pasture, where the old barn had once stood, the one that burned down 15 years ago. He'd rebuilt it years later, but the soil there still carried the scent of smoke after heavy rain. One evening, Margaret found him there, leaning on a fence post, hat pulled low against the drizzle. "Amos said you've been out here since noon," she said. He didn't turn. "Can't seem to stay away. You ever notice how the land remembers, even when we try to forget?" She stepped beside him, resting her hands on the rail. Maybe remembering is its way of honoring what was lost. He looked at her then, eyes the color of slate under rain. You talk like you've buried something, too. She hesitated. I have. Your husband. She nodded slowly. Thomas Hale. He died in the war. I was 29. For a long time, I thought grief was loyalty, that moving on meant betrayal. But grief's like this ground, it can't grow anything new until you break it open again. The rain thickened, cold drops running down the wood between them. Elias said quietly, the night of the fire, I was 3 miles out, fixing a gate. When I saw the smoke, I ran so hard my chest near split. But by the time I got here, he stopped, voice catching. They were gone. Annie and our boy. I tried to save the horses, but they'd already bolted. The house went next. I buried 'em both by the creek. Margaret listened, silent, letting the wind and rain fill the space where words would have felt small. Finally, she said, and you kept living. He gave a short, rough laugh. Not sure that's what I'd call it. You did, she said softly. You built fences, fed horses, kept this land alive. That's not nothing. Elias, that's love, even if it didn't look like it. He looked down at her, eyes damp not from rain. You've got a way of making hard things sound gentler than they are. Truth doesn't have to hurt to be real, she said. A gust of wind swept through, carrying the scent of pine and river water. Elias reached up and touched her sleeve lightly, as though anchoring himself to the moment. I didn't think I'd ever talk about that again. Sometimes it takes another broken thing to know where the cracks are, she said. They stood there until the rain eased into mist. When they walked back, the clouds were parting, and a faint band of light stretched over the hills. That night, Elias didn't eat supper in the kitchen like usual. He brought his plate to the parlor and sat across from her by the fire. The conversation drifted easily now about the calves being born, about Amos's stubborn leg, about nothing and everything. Before bed, he said quietly, I'm glad you came here, Margaret. She looked up from her sewing. So am I. A few days later, she found Amos sitting on the porch, whittling a piece of pine. Boss has been different lately, he said with a small grin. Ain't glaring at the sunrise no more. Margaret laughed softly. Maybe he finally realized it wasn't to blame. Amos chuckled, nodding. You got a way about you, ma'am. Ain't loud, but folks listen just the same. Silence has its uses, she said, smiling. Spring came slowly. One morning, the air smelled of lilacs, and the first meadowlark called from the fence line. Margaret took her wash outside, hanging the clothes on the line. Elias rode back from the south pasture, reins loose, hat tipped back. He stopped near her, watching the sheets flutter in the wind. Looks like the house is breathing again. She smiled. So is its owner. He tilted his head, half amused. Careful. Miss Hale, you keep talking like that. Folks'll think you've tamed me. She met his gaze. Maybe I just reminded you you're still alive? He laughed, the sound warm and low. That you did. Later that afternoon, they walked by the creek. The grass was bright green, the water running high from the melted snow. Elias stopped near a small wooden cross beneath a willow tree. She's here, he said softly. Annie and the boy. I never brought anyone here before. Margaret placed a hand on his arm. Thank you for trusting me. He looked out across the water, for the first time in a long while. I think maybe they'd be glad I'm still here. They would, she said. Love doesn't end. It just changes its shape. He nodded, and for a long moment, neither moved. The wind lifted the willow branches, and somewhere far off, thunder rolled faintly over the mountains. As they walked back, a light rain began to fall again, gentle, cleansing, like a blessing. That night, she found a wildflower laid on her pillow, pale yellow and still damp from rain. She didn't need a note to know who had placed it there, and though no words passed between them about what it meant, the silence that followed was no longer a wall. It was a bridge. The sun had grown stronger by April, spilling gold across the valley. The air no longer carried the bite of frost. Instead, it smelled of wet grass, blooming sage, and life beginning again. The ranch thrummed with movement, foals born, fences mended, and the sound of hammering as Amos's men repaired the south barn. Margaret had taken to spending her mornings on the porch with a book and a pot of tea, listening to the soft hum of bees around the lilac bushes she had planted weeks before. Every so often, Elias would come up from the pasture to join her, sitting on the steps, hat in his hands, as if her quiet steadiness drew him there without asking. One such morning, as the light slanted long and golden, a rider appeared on the road, dust rising behind him in thin curls. Amos noticed first, squinting into the sun. "Looks like someone from town," he muttered. The rider slowed near the gate, dismounted, and walked toward them with an air of practiced confidence. Margaret's stomach turned before he even reached the porch. She knew that gait, that tilt of the chin. It was Thomas Avery. He removed his hat and gave a shallow smile. "Miss Hale." Elias rose slowly from the step beside her. His voice was measured, low. "You know this man?" Margaret's hands tightened around the teacup. "I did. Once." Thomas nodded, unfazed by the tension that gathered in the air. "I reckon you did, and I reckon you've made quite the life for yourself since then." His gaze slid to Elias, assessing, almost mocking. Didn't take long. Did it? Elias's shoulders stiffened. "You got something to say. Say it plain." Thomas's smile didn't reach his eyes. "I came to make peace, to apologize. The way things went at the station, that wasn't how I meant it. I was misled by the agency. Letters got twisted, but I figure maybe we both got a second chance here." Margaret stood, calm but firm. "You figure wrong." Thomas's brow furrowed. "You'd rather stay here, what, as his housekeeper? Don't fool yourself. Margaret, a man like him don't take charity without wanting something in return." The words hung heavy in the air, sharp as barbed wire. Amos took a step forward, but Elias held up a hand. His tone stayed level, though his jaw tightened. "Watch your mouth." Thomas smirked. "You can't blame me for wondering. Mr. Grant, after all, folks in town talk. They say you've gone soft, letting some widow play lady of the house." Before Margaret could speak, Elias moved not fast, not violent, but deliberate. He stepped close enough that the air between them went still. "You'll leave now," he said quietly, "and you won't come back." Thomas looked past him, to Margaret. "So that's it. You're really staying." She met his gaze, her voice steady. "I already told you once. Thomas, the past came knocking. I'm not answering." He hesitated, searching her face for weakness, and found none. "Fine," he said finally, forcing a laugh. "Enjoy your little fairy tale, Miss Hale. The West's got a way of reminding folks that stories don't last." He turned, mounted his horse, and rode off without another word. The moment he disappeared down the road, The silence that followed felt like a door closing for good. Margaret exhaled, slow and even. He hasn't changed. Still thinks the world owes him forgiveness. Elias looked at her, his expression unreadable. You handled him better than I would have. You don't need to fight ghosts, she said softly. They die faster when you don't give them breath. He gave a small nod. Still, I wish he hadn't come. You don't deserve to have that shame dragged back up. I'm not ashamed, she said. Not anymore. I only wish I'd learned sooner that walking away isn't weakness, it's choosing peace. That night, the ranch felt quieter than usual. The wind had stilled, and even the crickets seemed to hush early. Margaret sat by the fire with her mending, but her thoughts lingered on Elias, his patience, his stillness when anger could have ruled him. She realized then that strength didn't always come from swinging fists or shouting louder. Sometimes it was the ability to stay rooted when everything around you tried to pull you apart. Later, she heard footsteps in the hall. Elias stood in the doorway, hat in hand. Couldn't sleep, he said. Mind if I sit? Of course not. He took the chair across from her, staring into the fire. Men like him, they think the world owes them something. Truth is, it doesn't owe any of us. We just get what we build. She nodded. And what you've built here, it's worth more than he'll ever understand. He looked at her then, eyes catching the firelight. You think this place can really be whole again? She smiled gently. It already is. You just haven't let yourself believe it. He let out a quiet breath. You talk like hope's easy. It isn't, she said, but it's honest, and it's what's kept both of us alive. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. You've got a way of making me see things I didn't think I could anymore. Maybe that's what we're here for, she said, to remind each other that the worst's already behind us. For a while, they said nothing more. The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney. When Elias finally rose, he paused by her chair. He won't trouble you again, he said. I know. You sure you're all right? She looked up at him, her voice steady. I've been all right since the day I got off that train. He nodded once, the smallest smile touching his lips, then left her to the quiet. Outside, the wind had returned, whispering through the trees, soft as forgiveness. The next morning, a letter arrived from the sheriff. Thomas Avery had left town before dawn, heading south toward Wyoming. There'd been no trouble, no goodbyes, just absence, clean and final. Margaret folded the letter and tucked it into the stove's fire. The paper curled, blackened, and disappeared. When Elias came in for breakfast, she greeted him with a calm smile. The past's gone for good, she said simply. Then maybe it's time we start thinking about the future, he answered. She poured him coffee, her heart lighter than it had been in years. The summer heat arrived early that year, thick and restless. By June, the valley air shimmered like glass, and every breath seemed to carry the weight of thunder waiting somewhere beyond the mountains. The horses grew jumpy in the fields, stamping and snorting at every gust of wind. Even the dogs felt it, pacing near the porch, uneasy. Margaret could sense it too. The land was holding its breath for weeks. Elias had been busy at the south end of the property, repairing fences and overseeing a new storage barn. Margaret kept to the house, canning peaches, mending sheets, and pretending the heat didn't bother her. But each night, when lightning flickered on the far horizon, she'd glance through the window toward the ridge and think of him out there alone, surrounded by the dry grass that could catch fire with a single spark. One afternoon, Amos came riding hard into the yard, hat soaked in sweat. Storms rolling in fast. Miss Hale, he warned, you best bolt them shutters. Mr. Grant's still out near the ridge. Margaret set down her jar of preserves. He shouldn't be out there with the wind like this. He knows the land, Amos said, but his voice betrayed worry. By sunset, the sky had turned the color of bruised copper. The air crackled with tension. Margaret closed every window, fastened the doors, and checked the lanterns twice. The first drops of rain hissed on the porch roof like tiny sparks. Then the wind came sharp, fierce, carrying the smell of ozone and dust. She was standing by the parlor window when she saw a flash that wasn't lightning, rising from the south field. A heartbeat later, she smelled smoke. "Oh, God," she whispered. Grabbing her shawl, she ran outside. Amos was already saddling his horse. "It's the new barn," he shouted over the wind. "Lightning must have hit the roof. I'm going," she said. He stared at her. "No, ma'am, too dangerous," but she was already moving, skirts whipping around her legs. "I'm not staying behind." The two rode out into the storm, rain cutting sideways, lightning ripping across the sky. The closer they came, the thicker the smoke grew, stinging her eyes and throat. The new barn was a silhouette of fire against the dark roof collapsing inward. Flames licking the sky. "Where's Elias?" she shouted. Amos pointed toward the corral. "Was rounding the horses. I ain't seen him since Margaret leapt down before he could stop her, pulling her shawl over her face." The heat was blinding, the wind turning the smoke into a living thing. She stumbled through it, calling his name. "Elijah, Elijah." A shadow moved near the corral fence. Then his voice, hoarse but alive. "Get back, Margaret." He was struggling with a gate latch, trying to drive the panicked horses out before the flames trapped them. The animals screamed, wild with fear. She ran to his side, grabbing a loose rope, and together they pulled the gate open. The horses bolted into the rain, hooves thundering into the distance. When the last of them were clear, a crack sounded overhead. A burning beam split loose from the roof and crashed down behind them. Elias grabbed her, pulling her clear just as sparks rained down. They fell hard into the mud, coughing, the heat so close it felt like it was breathing down their necks. He rolled onto his back, gasping. "You shouldn't have come. I wasn't going to let you die out here," she said, her voice raw. The fire roared higher, wind feeding it like a living beast. Elias glanced toward the house in the distance, faint through the smoke. "If it jumps the road, the whole place'll go up. Then we stop it here," she said. They worked until their arms ached, forming a fire break, beating the flames with wet blankets, hauling water from the troughs. Amos and the hands joined them, shouting orders through the storm. At last, rain began to fall in earnest, heavy and cold. The flames hissed and sank into steam. The barn collapsed into itself, glowing embers fading to a dull red. When it was finally over, Margaret sank to her knees in the mud, shaking from exhaustion. Elias knelt beside her, chest heaving. For a long moment, neither spoke. Only the sound of rain filled the space between them. He reached out, brushing soot from her cheek with the back of his hand. "You saved the ranch." She shook her head. "We saved it?" He gave a quiet, broken laugh. "You got more courage than half the men I've ever known. I just did what had to be done." The rain softened to a drizzle. Around them, The ranch lay in ruin and renewal, charred timbers still smoking, the smell of wet ash in the air, but through the wreckage, the fences stood, the house untouched, the horses safe. As dawn bled over the hills, the first light touched the wet ground, turning it gold. Elias looked toward the horizon, then back at her. "You're hurt," he said. "Only tired." He shook his head. "No, you've been carrying this place on your shoulders same as me. I just didn't see it till now." Margaret met his gaze, her voice low. "You've been carrying ghosts. I've been trying to build something for the living. Maybe it's time those two things met in the middle." He stared at her for a long moment, then said softly, "If it weren't for you, I'd have let it all burn." She smiled faintly. "You're not made to give up, Elias. You just needed someone to remind you." As they walked back toward the house, the sun rose higher, burning through the fog. The light caught on her hair, on the streak of soot across her cheek, and he thought she looked like something fierce and sacred, like the land itself after rain. Later that morning, Amos found them on the porch, side by side, watching the smoke drift away. He nodded toward the field. "Could have been worse," he said. "It could have been everything." Elias answered quietly, "But it wasn't." Margaret rested her hands around a mug of coffee. "Fire doesn't just destroy," she said. "Sometimes it clears the ground for something new." Elias looked out across the valley. Then maybe this was what the land needed. She glanced at him. "And maybe it's what we needed too." The day stretched slow and peaceful after that. The ranch hands cleared the debris, laughter returning with the sun. Margaret hung fresh linens to dry, the white fabric fluttering in the breeze like a banner of victory. And though her body ached, her heart was steady. The fire hadn't broken them. It had bound them closer than either dared admit. That night, when the wind was calm again, Elias walked her to her room. "I owe you more than thanks," he said quietly. "You owe me nothing," she replied. "We both just chose to fight for the same thing." He lingered in the doorway. "Still, I'll remember tonight for as long as I live." "So will I," she said. When he finally turned to go, Margaret whispered after him, though he was already halfway down the hall. "Some fires don't burn to destroy. They burn to reveal." The week after the fire passed in a haze of rebuilding, the smell of smoke lingered long after the last embers had gone cold, a reminder of how close everything had come to ending. Yet amidst the ashes, life carried on. The hands sang as they worked. Amos whistled again, and the horses grazed quietly in the field as if nothing had happened. Margaret moved through the days with a steady calm. Her hands were blistered from hauling buckets, her arms sore from scrubbing soot, but she felt a strange lightness, an inner peace that hadn't been there before. Every morning, when she stepped onto the porch and saw the hills still green and the sky still wide, she whispered a small prayer of thanks. Elias, though, had changed in quieter ways. He spoke less, but looked more, really looked. When she caught his eyes across the room, there was something there she hadn't seen before. Gratitude, yes, but also an unspoken warmth, a question half-formed but never asked. One evening, after the men had turned in and the ranch lay wrapped in the soft hum of crickets, he came to find her in the parlor. The air outside was cool, carrying the scent of rain-soaked earth and pine inside. The fire crackled gently. "You're still up," he said, leaning against the doorway. "Couldn't sleep," she replied. "The wind's too still. It feels like the world's holding its breath again. He nodded and stepped closer, his boots quiet on the worn rug. Mind if I sit a spell? Of course not. He lowered himself into the chair opposite hers. The firelight caught on the small cuts across his knuckle scars from that night, healed but visible. They're rebuilding the south barn faster than I thought, she said softly. Amos says it'll be done before harvest. He smiled faintly. That man's too stubborn to let a little fire stop him. Silence settled comfortably between them, broken only by the pop of wood in the hearth. Then Elias said quietly, "You scared me that night." She looked up, startled. "I scared you?" He nodded, eyes on the flames. "When I saw you running into the smoke, I thought I'd lose you too." Her voice softened. "You won't lose me that easily." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, voice low. "Margaret, I've spent years building fences around myself, around this land, too. Thought if I kept everything under control, I wouldn't have to feel the rest of it, the pain, the want, the loneliness." She didn't speak, letting him find the words. "But the night of the fire," he continued, "watching you fight beside me, I realized something. The fences don't keep out the loss, they just keep out the living. And I've been starving for a long damn time." The admission hung between them, fragile and raw. Margaret's heart beat slow and heavy. She set down her sewing, folding her hands in her lap. Elias. He looked at her then, eyes bright with something that was almost fear. "I'm not a man who knows how to say things right, but I know this when I saw that barn burn. I wasn't thinking about the land or the money. I was thinking about you, about how I couldn't bear it if you didn't come back out of that smoke." Her throat tightened, words catching before they could form. He stood, pacing once, then turned back toward her. "You brought something back to this place I thought was gone for good. You made it breathe again. You made me breathe again." She rose slowly, every heartbeat loud in the stillness. "Elias, we've both been through fires of our own. Maybe this, whatever it is, belongs to what comes after, not before." He stepped closer. "Maybe, but I can't pretend anymore that it don't matter." They stood there in the quiet, the air thick with unspoken things. The firelight flickered between them, gold and uncertain. Then, almost without thinking, she reached up and touched the scar along his jaw, a thin white line she hadn't noticed before. He didn't move. "Does it still hurt?" she asked. "Not the scar," he said. "Just the things it reminds me of." Her hand lingered a moment longer before falling away. "Scars don't vanish," she said softly. "They just stop bleeding." He exhaled, slow and heavy, and something in that sound broke the space between them. "I don't want to ask for what I don't deserve," he said. "But if there's a chance, any chance you could see this place as home, not just refuge, I'd wait as long as it takes." Her eyes met his, and for the first time, she let the truth of her own longing surface. "You don't need to wait," she whispered. "Home isn't a place, Elias. It's the person you stop running from." For a long moment, they said nothing. Then he took her hand gently, his rough palm warm against hers. They stood that way, silent and steady, until the fire burned low and the world outside was wrapped in peace. When she finally spoke again, it was barely above a whisper. "You know, the night of the fire, when I thought we might not make it, I wasn't afraid of dying." He frowned slightly. "Then what I was afraid of dying before I'd told you what you meant to me?" Elias's breath caught, Then, quietly, he said, "Well, consider me told." A faint smile curved her lips. "And what about you?" He squeezed her hand gently. "I think you already know." They stayed like that a while longer, the night stretching soft and endless around them. Outside, the first stars began to appear over the ridge, their light faint but certain. When they finally parted for the night, it was without ceremony or promise, just the quiet understanding that something had changed forever. Later, alone in her room, Margaret stood by the window, watching the horizon. The air smelled faintly of rain and lilac. Somewhere downstairs, Elias moved through the house, his footsteps slow, deliberate, steady. The sound was enough to make her heart ache in the gentlest way. She closed her eyes and whispered, "Some fences aren't meant to keep us safe. They're meant to teach us how to open the gate." And for the first time in years, she fell asleep without dreaming of leaving. By the time autumn crept into the valley, the land had begun to heal. The hills wore a soft amber hue, and the evening smelled faintly of wood smoke and ripened grain. Every sunset stretched longer, deeper, as if the sky itself wanted to linger over the season before the frost returned. Margaret walked the fence line each morning, her skirts brushing against tall golden grass. The air was crisp, her breath visible in small clouds. The ranch was quiet in a way that felt full, not empty like a held breath between heartbeats. Since that night in the parlor, she and Elias had found a new rhythm. Nothing had been spoken aloud again, but everything had changed. There were glances that lingered longer than they used to, moments of silence that hummed with meaning. When their hands brushed passing a tool, or she caught him watching her stir the fire, there was no embarrassment, only recognition. One evening, after the cattle had been driven in for the season, Elias invited the ranch hands to stay for supper. Margaret cooked stew and biscuits, the smell of sage and roasted beef filling the air. The men's laughter drifted through the open windows, and for the first time in years, the big house felt alive with joy. Amos raised his cup toward Margaret. "To the lady who's brought more light into this place than the sun itself," he said with a grin. She laughed softly, embarrassed. "You'll have them expecting pie for breakfast next." Elias's eyes found hers across the table. "Wouldn't be the worst thing," he said. Later, when the men had gone, she stepped out onto the porch. The night was cold and clear, the stars sharp above the dark hills. The wind carried the faint sound of coyotes far off. Elias joined her quietly, his hands tucked in his coat pockets. "You've made this place a home again," he said after a long silence. "It was always a home," she replied. "It just needed someone to see it that way." He studied her profile in the starlight. "You ever think about leaving going back east?" She shook her head. "There's nothing for me back there. Out here, it feels honest. Every sunrise, every ache, every bit of work, it all means something." Elias looked out over the fields. "It does, more than most folks understand." She turned toward him, her voice gentle. "You built all this with your hands, and you kept it alive when no one else could. That takes a kind of strength most people never know." He gave a small, crooked smile. "Don't know about strength, maybe just stubbornness. Sometimes that's the same thing," she said. The porch lantern flickered as a gust of wind swept through. He glanced at her, his eyes soft. "I was thinking Harvest Festival's coming up in Willow Creek next week. You ever been?" She smiled faintly. Not since I was a girl. Then maybe it's time you went again. You mean we? His grin deepened. Reckon I do. At the festival, the town square was strung with lanterns. The air smelled of cider and pine smoke, laughter echoing from every stall. Music floated from the bandstand, a slow fiddle tune that wrapped around the crowd like a memory. Elias guided her through the throng, his hand light at her back. People turned as they passed, some out of curiosity, others out of surprise, but the murmurs that once followed her were gone. What replaced them was something quieter, more respectful. Mrs. Coulter, resplendent in a velvet coat, approached with a practiced smile. Miss Hale, Mr. Grant, it's been some time. Margaret met her gaze evenly. It has. I hope you've been well. Well enough, the woman replied, eyes flicking briefly to Elias. It's good to see the ranch flourishing again. We were all quite worried after the fire. Fires can destroy or renew, Margaret said simply. This one chose renewal. Mrs. Coulter hesitated, then inclined her head. I suppose it did. As the evening wore on, the music shifted to a waltz. Elias offered his hand. One dance I thought you didn't dance, she teased. I don't, he said, smiling, but I'll try. They moved slowly across the packed dirt square, the crowd fading around them. He wasn't graceful, but his steps were sure, his hand steady at her waist. She rested her head against his shoulder, feeling the slow rhythm of his breath, the strength beneath his gentleness. When the song ended, neither stepped back. They stood still, letting the applause wash past like distant rain. On the way home, the road glowed silver under the moonlight. The wagon wheels creaked softly, and the night smelled of hay and wood smoke. You ever think about what's next? She asked quietly. He looked at her. What do you mean, after all this, the work, the ranch, the seasons, what comes after? He thought for a moment. Maybe just peace, maybe someone to share the quiet with when the day's done. She smiled faintly. That sounds a lot like what I want too. Back at the ranch, she lingered a moment before going inside. The night was still, the air crisp. He came to stand beside her on the porch. Margaret, he said softly, the day you came here, I figured it'd be temporary. That one day you'd go back to wherever it was you belonged. But I was wrong. How so? Because you belong here. This land, this house, it all breathes different since you came. I reckon I do too. She turned toward him, her eyes shining faintly in the moonlight. You once said you'd wait as long as it took. You don't have to wait anymore. He stepped closer, brushing a strand of hair from her face. You sure? She nodded. I've never been sure of anything. For a long time, neither spoke. The only sound was the wind moving through the trees, soft and low like a sigh. When he finally kissed her, it was unhurried, steady like two people who had already shared a lifetime of silence and finally found the words they'd been missing. When they parted, the world seemed quieter, fuller somehow. He rested his forehead against hers. Guess that's our autumn promise, he murmured. She smiled. A promise for whatever comes next. The next morning, the ranch woke to frost on the fence rails and sunlight spilling over the hills. The fields shimmered pale gold, and the air carried the first whisper of winter. Margaret stood at the kitchen window, watching Elias saddle his horse. When he glanced back, their eyes met through the glass. He tipped his hat, and she lifted her hand in return. The world outside was changing again, but this time, neither of them feared what lay ahead. Winter came early that year. By late November, frost had crept over every window pane, turning the ranch into a landscape of silver and silence. The air smelled of pine and wood smoke, and the snow made a soft hush over everything. Life slowed, as it always did when the nights grew long. Margaret loved these mornings, the quiet before sunrise. The sound of logs crackling in the stove, the sight of breath curling in the air. The ranch hands still rose before dawn, but now even Amos walked slower, his limp heavier in the cold. The horses snorted steam into the air as Elias brushed them down, his breath coming in pale clouds. He'd grown leaner, somehow younger, since autumn. The lines around his eyes had softened, and laughter found him easier these days. When Margaret caught him smiling at something Amos said, she thought how time could be kind when given reason. One morning, as she poured coffee into his mug, he said quietly, "You've turned this house into something I never thought it could be again." She glanced up, half smiling. A home. He nodded, and not just a place to sleep. Her heart warmed at the words. Then it was worth every scar and every storm. He reached across the table, his rough hand brushing hers. More than worth it. They stayed like that for a moment, two souls who had found peace in each other's company until the sound of hoofbeats broke the quiet. Amos entered a few minutes later, shaking snow from his coat. Post rider came through early. "Got something for you. Miss Hale." Margaret took the letter, her name written in a hand she didn't recognize. The paper was thick, the seal marked with the insignia of the Denver Telegraph Office. She frowned, breaking it open. Her eyes moved over the page, and the color drained from her face. Elias straightened. "What is it?" She didn't answer right away. "Finally," she said, "it's from a lawyer in Denver. He says Thomas Avery's been arrested." Elias's expression hardened. "For what fraud?" "Theft. And there's mention of my name. He'd been using letters from the agency, our correspondence, to solicit money from other women, claiming to be my husband." Elias swore under his breath. "That bastard." Margaret folded the letter slowly, her hands trembling. "The lawyer says they found my letters among his things. He asked if I would come testify." "You don't owe him a damn thing," Elias said firmly. "I know," she whispered, "but maybe it's not about him. Maybe it's about ending what he started." He studied her, jaw tight. "You'd have to travel in winter." "Alone?" "I wouldn't be alone," she said softly. He frowned, then realized what she meant. "You'd want me to go. I'd want you there if you'll come," she said simply. For a moment, the only sound was the wind outside, pushing snow against the windows. Then he nodded once. "Then I'll come." 2 days later, they set out before dawn, bundled against the cold. The world was white and still, the horizon a blur between snow and sky. The wagon wheels crunched over the frozen ground, and the horses' hooves sent up soft puffs of powder. They stopped at small inns along the way, rough places, with weak coffee and stronger winds, but Margaret found comfort in the quiet rhythm of their journey. Elias handled the reins, his gloved hands steady. At night, by the fire, they spoke little, but the silence between them was full of warmth. By the time they reached Denver, snow had begun to fall again. The city was louder than Margaret remembered iron wheels, shouting vendors, church bells echoing through narrow streets. She had almost forgotten how many people could exist in one place. The courthouse was tall and cold, its marble steps slick with ice. Inside, the air smelled of ink and dust. Margaret stood straight, her gloves tight in her hands, as Thomas was brought in. He looked older, eyes hollow, clothes ill-fitting, but when he saw her, his expression twisted into something like bitterness. "Didn't think you'd come," he said under his breath. "I didn't come for you." She replied. Her testimony was brief but clear. She spoke of the letters, of the deceit, of the choices she'd made since. The judge listened without interruption. When she finished, there was silence. Then the gavel came down, and the past every echo of it was finally sealed away. Outside, the snow fell heavier. Elias waited by the steps, his coat collar turned up against the cold. When she reached him, he asked, "You all right?" She nodded, lighter than I've felt in years. He offered his arm. "Then let's go home." They stayed one night in Denver before heading back. The inn's window looked out over the lamp-lit street. She stood there for a long time, watching the snowfall, her reflection faint in the glass. Elias came up behind her, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. "Feels different now," he said quietly. "It does," she agreed, like something finally let go. "Maybe that's what forgiveness feels like," he said. She turned to face him. "Then maybe I can forgive myself too." He brushed his thumb gently across her cheek. "You already have." On the journey home, the sky cleared, and the mountains shone white and endless. They didn't rush. At night, they camped near the river, the stars bright and close. Margaret listened to the sound of the water and thought how strange it was how a life could begin again. Not in youth, but in the quiet years when one stopped expecting it. When they reached the ranch, Amos was waiting at the gate. "Place is still standing," he said with a grin, "and the cattle ain't missed you much." Elias laughed. "Good to know someone can do my job better than me." Margaret smiled, stepping down from the wagon. The air was sharp and clean, the valley shining under a pale sun. "Home," she whispered, that night, as snow began to fall again. Elias lit the fire. Margaret joined him by the hearth, a pot of coffee between them. He handed her a cup, his eyes soft in the firelight. "You did the right thing," he said. "Maybe," she replied, "but I didn't do it alone." He smiled faintly. "You never have to again." For a moment, neither spoke. Then she said, "Elias, do you believe people can start over completely?" He thought for a while before answering. "No," he said finally, "not completely. But we can keep what was good and let the rest fall away. That's enough for me." She looked at him across the flickering light. "It's enough for me, too." Outside. The snow fell silently, blanketing the scars of the past. Inside, two hearts once bruised, once broken, beat steady in the quiet rhythm of beginning again. Winter deepened across the Montana Valley, folding the land beneath a heavy quilt of snow. Days were short and quiet, the light blue and silver even at noon. Smoke curled from the ranch chimney in a soft spiral, rising into air that never quite lost the scent of pine. Inside, warmth and laughter had taken root, small, steadfast miracles against the long cold. Margaret woke before dawn, as she always did, to tend the stove and set the coffee to brew. She'd grown used to this rhythm, the hush of morning before the world stirred. The house no longer echoed the way it once had. Now it hummed with quiet life. There were voices again, Amos humming tunelessly while he worked, the stable hands teasing each other outside, and above all, there was Elias. He came in from the barn that morning, dusted with snow, his cheeks flushed from the cold. "Wind's picking up," he said, stamping his boots by the door. "Sky looks like it's thinking about another storm." Margaret poured him coffee, smiling. "Then we'll stay in and let it happen." He took the cup, his fingers brushing hers. "You make the best of everything, don't you?" "Someone has to," she said lightly, though the warmth in her eyes softened the jest. That afternoon, Amos rode into Willow Creek for supplies. When he returned, he carried more than flour and sugar, ran into Reverend Hill. He said, dismounting. "He asked when you two plan on making things official." Elias froze halfway through unloading the sacks. Official Amos grinned. "Reckon that's preacher talk for married." Margaret laughed, though her cheeks turned pink. "Amos Reed, you gossip worse than any townswoman." He tipped his hat with mock solemnity. "Just passing along what the Lord's messenger said." Then he added, softer, "Truth is, folks are happy for you. It's been a long time since this valley's seen good news." When Amos disappeared into the barn, Elias set down the flour sack and looked at her. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, quietly, "He's right. You know, about what? About making things official." Margaret's heart skipped. I mean, I should have asked you long ago." He took a small step closer, his voice low and steady. "I ain't a man of fancy words. But I know this, you're the reason this place breathes again. The reason I do. I can't imagine another season without you beside me." She stared up at him, the world narrowing to the sound of his breath and the snow tapping softly against the window. "Elias Grant," she said finally, "you took your time." He smiled, that slow, genuine smile she'd come to love. "Didn't want to scare you off. You never could." "Then is that a yes?" "It's a yes," she whispered. They decided on a small wedding. No town spectacle, just the people who had stood beside them through storms and fire. The ceremony would take place on Christmas Eve, under the old pine behind the house. In the days leading up to it, the ranch became a flurry of quiet preparations. Amos carved lantern poles and polished the sleigh runners. Margaret stitched her own dress, a simple cream wool trimmed with lace she'd brought from back east years ago. Elias cleaned the parlor himself, muttering that it had never looked so fine, though he couldn't stop tracking snow across the floor. On the morning of the wedding, the valley woke to sunlight breaking over the hills, the snow glittering like fields of glass. Margaret stood before her mirror, fastening her shawl. She caught sight of herself and smiled faintly. The woman, staring back, wasn't the one who had stepped off the train months ago, unsure and alone. This one stood tall, her eyes clear and bright with purpose. Outside, the guests gathered Amos, Reverend Hill, a few ranch hands, and their wives. The air was sharp, but still. Elias waited by the pine, his black coat crisp against the white snow. When Margaret stepped out, the murmurs quieted. Her breath misted in the cold, her cheeks flushed from the wind. Elias's eyes never left her. "You look," he began, then stopped, shaking his head with a soft laugh. "There ain't a word for it." "That's all right," she said, smiling. "Some things don't need words." The ceremony was short, as winter weddings often are. The Reverend spoke of renewal, of love found after loss. Margaret barely heard the words, only the rhythm of Elias's breathing, the strength of his hand in hers, the low hum of wind through the trees. When Reverend Hill said, "You may kiss your bride," Elias hesitated for a heartbeat, as if to make sure this wasn't still a dream. Then he leaned down and kissed her gently, the cold air catching around them like applause. Applause followed anyway, cheers, laughter, and Amos's voice booming. About time. They spent the rest of the afternoon in the house, the fire roaring, coffee and cider flowing. The hands played cards, and Amos told stories louder than anyone could stop. Margaret sat near the hearth, her hand resting in Elias's, her heart full. Later, when the last guest had gone and the fire burned low, she and Elias stepped out into the night. The moon hung high, silvering the snow. The world was utterly still. Elias reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small velvet pouch. "Wasn't much for rings," he said, "but Amos found this in town." Inside lay a simple gold band, warm from his hand. He slipped it onto her finger. "Fits just right," he murmured. She looked up at him, eyes shining. "It does." They stood there under the pine, the same tree that had witnessed their vows. Snow began to fall again, soft, slow, endless. "Strange thing," he said, voice quiet. "Used to think winter was just what you endured till spring. But now, it feels like the world's just holding its breath for something good." She smiled. "That's because it is." When they went back inside, he poured 2 cups of cider and raised his glass. "To second chances," he said, "to home." She replied. "To both," he said, and they drank to it the taste of apple and spice, sweet and new, the taste of everything they'd fought to keep. That night, as they stood before the window watching the snow drift down, Margaret whispered, "You ever think about how far we've come?" Elias nodded slowly. "Every day. And every day I thank the good Lord I answered that letter." She smiled, resting her head against his shoulder. "And I thank him you wrote it." The wind sighed outside, and the fire crackled softly. For the first time in years, both of them belonged entirely to the moment, to the warmth of the hearth, the hush of falling snow, and the promise of all the winters yet to come. By February, the snow began to loosen its grip. The icicles dripping from the roof melted a little earlier each day, and the air carried that faint, wet sweetness that only came before spring. The valley still wore its winter coat, but beneath it, something living was stirring again. Margaret woke one morning to sunlight cutting through the lace curtains, painting thin stripes across the quilt. Elias was already gone from the bed. She could hear him outside with the horses, his voice low and even. The sound made her smile. It had been 2 months since their wedding, and yet the novelty of waking in the same house, sharing the same quiet, hadn't faded. Every day still felt like something new, not in grand gestures, but in small, ordinary miracles, the smell of his coffee in the kitchen, the creak of the porch steps under his boots, the warmth of his coat left hanging beside hers. When she joined him outside, the air was cold enough to sting her nose, but bright with promise. Elias stood by the corral, stroking the muzzle of a chestnut mare. "She's restless," Margaret said, coming up beside him. He nodded. "So's the land. You can feel it, it's waiting. For spring, for whatever comes next." She smiled. "Maybe we all are." He turned, his breath visible in the crisp air. "You ever think about going back east just to see it?" Margaret shook her head. "No, I think I've had enough of places that don't know how to keep quiet." He chuckled softly. You and this land, you're the same that way. You like the stillness. Stillness isn't the same as silence, she said. Stillness listens. Silence hides. He looked at her for a moment, then nodded. Guess that's why I can breathe easier now. This house used to be too quiet. Now it just feels still. The days stretched longer after that. Amos and the men began repairing the irrigation lines, preparing for spring planting. Margaret took to tending the small garden she'd started behind the kitchen, a few hardy herbs and early greens pushing up through the thawing soil. It wasn't much, but it felt good to see life returning. Sometimes, in the late afternoons, she'd sit with Elias on the porch, watching the sun sink behind the hills. He'd smoke his pipe in silence, and she'd knit or mend by lamplight. These were the hours she cherished most. Slow, simple, filled with a peace she never thought she'd know again. One evening, as the wind carried the faint cry of geese returning north, Elias spoke quietly. You ever wonder what brought you here? I mean, really here. She looked up from her mending. Fate? Maybe. I don't much believe in fate. Then, maybe choice. He nodded slowly. That I believe in. Then we both chose right, she said softly. He smiled faintly, but there was a shadow behind his eyes. She noticed it that night, and again the next morning. Something weighed on him, something he hadn't yet put into words. It wasn't until 3 days later, after supper, that he spoke of it. They were sitting by the fire, the world outside wrapped in darkness and wind. I got a letter today, he said, voice low. Margaret looked up. From whom bank in Helena, he said. They've been after me about selling part of the north pasture. Seems a mining company's been sniffing around again. Offering good money, too. She frowned. And what do you want to do? I don't want to sell, but I've got debts from years back, before things changed. I thought I'd paid most off, but looks like I miscalculated. If I can't settle it by summer, they'll come claim a portion of the land. Margaret set her sewing aside. How much? He hesitated. More than I'd like to admit. For a moment, the only sound was the crackle of the fire. Then she said quietly, We'll find a way. He met her gaze. You say that like you already got a plan. I don't, she said, but I've learned something here. When life takes from you, it doesn't mean you're meant to give up, it just means you're meant to start again. He gave a soft laugh, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. You talk like a preacher sometimes. Just someone who's been through enough to know starting over isn't failure. He leaned back, studying her. You really think we can keep this place? I know we can, she said. You built it once out of ashes. Elias, we both did, and we'll do it again if we have to. Her certainty steadied him more than numbers ever could. Over the next weeks, they worked with renewed purpose. Margaret took charge of the ranch books, finding ways to stretch every dollar. She began selling preserves and hand-woven shawls in town, small things, but they added up. Elias negotiated with neighboring ranchers for shared grazing contracts. Amos found a buyer for extra cattle feed left from the mild winter. Slowly, hope turned practical again. One afternoon, as the snow melted into soft streams along the fences, Elias came into the kitchen, wiping his hands. Bank sent word, he said, a rare smile breaking across his face. They're settling. We're square. Margaret turned from the stove, laughter spilling out of her like sunlight. You see, the land listens to those who love it. He stepped closer, his voice low. "Maybe it listens to you." She shook her head. "It listens to both of us." They went for a walk that evening, through the muddy field that would soon turn green again. The air was full of thawing scents, wet soil, pine sap, and smoke. "You ever think about children?" Elias asked suddenly. The question caught her off guard. She looked at him, then smiled softly. "I think about what kind of world we'd want to bring them into." He nodded. "One like this, maybe, where they'd know what work means, what kindness costs, where they'd know love doesn't have to shout to be true," she added. He reached for her hand. "You ever notice how the hardest winters make the best springs?" She squeezed his hand. "Yes, maybe that's true of people too." When they returned to the house, the first stars had appeared, faint and trembling over the horizon. Margaret paused on the porch, listening to the steady creak of the windmill turning in the distance. "Do you hear that?" she asked. He tilted his head. "Hear what? The land," she said softly. "It's waking up again." He smiled. "Guess it knows we're staying." That night, she dreamed of sunlight spilling across endless grass, of laughter echoing through open windows, of a life both ordinary and extraordinary in its peace. When she woke, the dream still clung to her, gentle as dawn. The world outside had shifted, the first crocus blooms pushing through the last crust of snow. Spring had come again, not just to the land, but to them. By May, the valley was a river of green. The snow melt fed the streams until they sang through the pasture, and the fields shimmered beneath the new sun. The air smelled of sage and wet earth, and everywhere there was the hum of life returning. Margaret rose each morning to birdsong and the creak of the windmill. Her days filled with small labors that stitched her more deeply into the land. She'd grown tan from working outside, her hair streaked with the faintest gold from the sun. The ranch hands often said she was more a part of the valley than the fences that held it. Elias, too, seemed to have settled into this season of peace. The weariness that had once shadowed him was gone, replaced by a quiet energy. They worked side by side in the fields, laughed over supper, and ended each day on the porch as the horizon melted into purple dusk. One afternoon, while she was hanging linens to dry, Amos came riding up from the post road, waving a letter. "Mail for you, Mrs. Grant," he called, his grin wide as the sky. Margaret wiped her hands on her apron, took the envelope, and frowned at the handwriting. It was neat, deliberate, the kind that came from someone who still used fountain pens and sealing wax. The return address read Sarah Whitcomb, Boston. She hadn't seen that name in over 20 years. Elias noticed her expression as she stood there, the wind tugging gently at the paper. "Old friend, older than that," she said softly. A piece of another life. That evening, after supper, she sat by lamplight and opened the letter. The first lines carried the familiar scent of ink and lavender, and her heart tightened. "My dearest Margaret, word has reached me through an acquaintance that you are well, and living out west. I can scarcely believe it. So many years have passed since the city, since everything changed. I wanted you to know that I never forgot you, nor the kindness you showed me when I was lost. If it pleases you, I would love to see you once more, or at least to know that you have found peace. There is another matter as well, one that may concern you more directly. A relative of yours has passed a cousin you may recall faintly, James Wentworth. His estate, modest but considerable, lists you among his heirs. The solicitor insists you must come to Boston in person to claim it before year's end. I understand if you choose to remain where you are, but I pray you'll write soon. You deserve every good thing this life has yet to offer. Yours in affection and friendship, Sarah. Margaret read the letter twice, her pulse quickening. The idea of Boston felt as distant as the moon its carriages, its crowded streets, the sound of polished shoes on cobblestone. It wasn't just another place, it was another life, another version of herself she thought had died long ago. When Elias entered the room, she folded the paper carefully. "It's from an old friend," she said. He poured himself a cup of coffee and nodded. "Good news, I'm not sure." She hesitated, then handed him the letter. "There's an inheritance, but I'd have to travel back east to claim it." He read in silence, brow furrowed. "Would it make a difference for us? I mean, maybe," she said quietly. "It could pay off the last of the bank debts, maybe even expand the ranch. But," she trailed off, "but it means going back." He finished for her. "Yes." He set the letter down, leaning back in his chair. "Do you want to?" She looked toward the window, where the last light of day spilled across the fields. "I don't know. Part of me wants to see it one last time to say goodbye. Maybe. Another part of me feels like I already did." He nodded slowly. "Then you ought to think on it. Whatever you choose, I'll stand by it." That night, she couldn't sleep. The sound of the wind through the eaves reminded her of trains leaving stations, of bells and farewells and choices. She thought of the girl she'd once been, the one who believed love was something found in letters, not built with hands and time. At dawn, she rose and went outside. The fields were wrapped in mist, the sun just a pale promise above the ridge. She walked to the far fence, where the land rolled away into blue distance. Elias found her there an hour later, leaning against the post. "You've been out here a while," he said softly. "I've been thinking about the letter." She nodded. "I could go. It would be easy enough to book passage from Helena. But if I go, I think something in me might stay there." He studied her for a long moment, his eyes kind. "You've built too much here to leave behind." "That's what I keep telling myself," she said, "but sometimes the past whispers louder than the wind." He stepped closer, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face. "The past can whisper all it wants. You don't owe it an answer." Her eyes shimmered, though her voice stayed steady. "You always know what to say." "Not always," he said with a small smile. "Just when it's about you." She laughed softly, the sound dissolving into the breeze. The next day, she wrote her reply. "My dearest Sarah, it warms me to know you think of me still. The years have carried us far, haven't they? I'm well better than I have been in a long time. I live where the air is clear and the days are honest, among people who remind me that goodness still exists in quiet places. As for Boston, I cannot come. My life belongs here now, in soil and sunlight and the steady work of hands that build instead of remember. Please extend my gratitude to the solicitor and to the memory of my cousin. I need no inheritance but the peace I have found. If ever you travel west, our door stands open. With love always, Margaret Grant." When she finished, she sealed the envelope and set it by the door for Amos to post on his next trip to town. That evening, as she and Elias sat on the porch watching the sky fade into lavender, he said quietly, "You made your choice." "Yes," she said. "I chose now. I chose us." He reached for her hand. his thumb tracing slow circles over her skin. Then the rest'll take care of itself. A meadowlark sang somewhere beyond the barn, its notes rising sweet and wild. The sound made her smile. She turned to him, voice soft. You ever wonder how a person knows when they've come home? He looked out at the horizon. Maybe when leaving stopped sounding like freedom. She leaned her head on his shoulder. Then I'm home. The sky darkened, stars pricking through one by one. Somewhere beyond the hills, the train tracks stretched eastward, but for the first time, Margaret felt no pull to follow them. By late August, the valley had turned gold again. The fields swayed like oceans of wheat, and every breeze smelled of hay and sunlight. The sky stretched endlessly, so blue it almost hurt to look at. Margaret stood by the fence one morning, her hands resting lightly on the wood, watching the horizon blur into heat and light. Summer had reached its height, and with it came that familiar stillness before change. Elias rode up from the lower pasture, his shirt damp with sweat, hat pushed back on his brow. We'll start cutting by next week, he said, dismounting. Crops look stronger than I've seen in years. That's good, she replied, smiling. Feels like the land's finally caught its breath. He nodded, then looked out toward the distant ridge. Funny thing, isn't it? How the hardest years always make the richest soil. Margaret followed his gaze. Maybe people are the same. They shared a quiet moment, both thinking of all that had come before the fire, the winters, the silences that had once filled this place. It seemed another lifetime now. The ranch no longer carried the weight of ghosts. It hummed instead with the rhythm of living. Inside the house, the kitchen smelled of peaches and bread. Margaret had taken to preserving jars for winter rows of amber and rose-colored glass, catching the sunlight on the shelves. Amos teased her for it, saying she'd turned into the heart and stomach of the ranch, but she only laughed. That evening, after supper, they sat on the porch as the light faded. The crickets had begun their song early, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called. The air was warm, heavy with the sweetness of cut grass. Elias leaned back in his chair. You ever think about what comes next? She smiled. Always, but not with worry anymore. He nodded slowly. Guess I used to think a man's worth was measured by what he could hold onto land. Money, pride. But you taught me it's measured by what he can give away and still feel whole. Her eyes softened. And you taught me that stillness doesn't mean standing still. He chuckled quietly. We've both been teachers. Then, a soft wind stirred, carrying the scent of sage and dust. Margaret closed her eyes for a moment, breathing it in. There's peace here. Elias, the kind that doesn't shout. He reached over and took her hand. I know, and I don't take a second of it for granted. When harvest began, the ranch came alive with motion. The fields echoed with the clatter of scythes, the hum of wagon wheels, the laughter of men working under the sun. Margaret brought water and bread to the hands, her skirts dusted with straw. Elias moved among them with the easy grace of a man who had learned to lead by doing. One afternoon, as they paused to rest beneath the old cottonwood, Margaret looked at him and thought how far he'd come from the silent, closed man she'd first met to this one open, steady, unafraid of joy. That night, the two of them stood at the window, watching lanterns flicker in the distant fields. The harvesters worked late, their voices drifting like old hymns across the valley. Do you hear that? Elias said softly. Sounds like the land singing to itself. She nodded, her voice almost a whisper. It's the sound of something finally healed. As autumn came, the fields emptied, the barns filled, and the valley quieted again. The mornings grew cool, the evenings softer. Margaret spent her time writing letters, one to Sarah back in Boston, another to a widowed woman she'd met through the agency years ago, encouraging her not to give up hope of finding a place to belong. Elias spent long hours repairing fences, mending what winter would soon test again. Yet, when the day's work ended, he always found her on the porch, waiting. Sometimes they didn't speak at all. The silence between them had changed. It wasn't distance anymore, but comfort. One evening, as the last leaves turned copper, Margaret brought out an old journal. She'd kept it since arriving, small notes, sketches, scraps of words that had carried her through. "I used to write here when I felt alone," she said, handing it to Elias. "Now I think I'll start a new one." He flipped through a few pages, reading the faded ink. "You should keep this," he said softly. "It's the story of how you found your way." She smiled. "No, Elias, it's the story of how we did." He closed the book gently and set it on the table beside her. "Then maybe we should finish it together." Winter returned, soft and steady. Snow gathered on the eaves, and smoke curled upward from the chimney. The ranch slept beneath its white blanket, peaceful and sure. Inside, the house was warm, filled with laughter when Amos dropped by for supper, with quiet companionship when the night grew long. On Christmas Eve, a year to the day since their wedding, Elias built a fire in the hearth. Margaret set 2 cups of cider by the flames. "Feels like we've come full circle," she said. He nodded. "Only this time, we're not waiting for what comes next. We're living it." She looked into the firelight, her eyes glowing. "Do you ever wonder if love always looks like this, quiet, ordinary?" He smiled. "Maybe the truest kind does." They sat together as snow began to fall outside. The world was hushed again, but this time the silence was full of life, every heartbeat, every memory, every moment they had earned. Margaret reached out and touched his hand. "Do you remember what you said once? That fences don't keep out the loss, they just keep out the living." He chuckled. "Seems you remember everything I say. I remember the things that matter." He looked at her for a long time, then said softly, "Then remember this too. I never thought I'd find peace in this life, but I did, because of you." She smiled, tears bright in her eyes. Then we both found it. Outside, the snow deepened, the sky glowing faintly with starlight. The ranch lay still and whole beneath it, every fence mended, every scar turned beautiful by time. And in that quiet forever, neither lonely nor loud, just perfectly alive they stayed. The story, they called her a mail-order bride. Millionaire Rancher called her mine. Before She Ever Left Town is not just a love story between 2 broken people, but a journey to find faith, peace, and self-worth after loss. It reminds us that age is never a limit to love, and the heart, even if it has been broken, can still learn to love again, if we are brave enough to open the door. Life, no matter how late, always gives us the chance to start over, gently, slowly, but deeply. Silence is sometimes a form of strength, and forgiveness is the way we heal old wounds. Thank you, the audience, for accompanying, listening, and feeling with all your heart. If you believe in stories that bring hope and warmth like this, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel to continue my journey to find the beautiful things in life.